I think you're right to suggest that we gambled, and it was a good gamble to take in the 1990s about bringing China in, inducing them to join the rules-based order, hoping that this would lead to gradual domestic transformation. After all, that happened in other parts of East Asia, so that there was a pattern that suggested it might work. Probably now in 2019, we might say it was a good gamble. It's not turning out the way we wanted it to. So the question, and coming to this question of a democratic community, there's been talk in the national security community about the need now to decouple. That the United States and China have a economic interdependence that is unhealthy, and that it's not necessarily we're going to cut China off, but that we should decouple some of that economic relations, and that we should actually, democratic community of states should actually be prepared to decouple from China and couple with each other more. The question, of course, is that there's expenses involved with that, and China's ability to make it worth the while, as we've seen now with Italy, signing up for Belt and Road, of, hey, here's our democratic principles, democratic community. On the other hand, this looks like a good economic deal. How are we going to be reconciling that as we move in the future, where a China that says we want to change the rules and we'll make it worth your while with investment, loans. For Americans, it's a whole bunch of cheaper consumer goods, versus getting people to sign up that maybe I'll be willing to pay more for goods and services if they're coming from domestically or from a democratic community. Is there a sense of how we might move forward with that as part of a strategy of dealing with China being essentially now outside of the democratic community?
Look, I think China, the challenge that China poses to the global order is certainly the most complex that we face, and I think you've described the strategic approach that was taken for many years, really since the end of the Cold War, as China began to embrace free markets, which is, let's continue to encourage China's economic connectivity to the world by bringing it into the international economic order and by grounding it in and giving it a stake in the international system. And for a while, that seemed to be the right way to approach it. China has used its engagement, its access to global markets to drive its own prosperity and to create a sense that it benefits and has a stake in a stable global order. So I think that story has produced partial success. But what didn't happen and what we haven't seen is the political openness that we and many people hoped would also come with as part of the package, that the Chinese government would loosen the strings, would open up its political system to give people greater autonomy, greater authority, and greater decision-making over their own lives, ultimately maybe even moving towards democratic elections. Instead, what the Chinese have done is they've leveraged their access to the global markets to reap the rewards economically, and then use that to actually entrench, I think, their Communist Party monopoly. And now we're seeing them, as they gain influence, challenge and deepen their engagement in the world that has run contrary to many of the norms that we've been talking about. So what do? I think that's right, that in terms of the economic interdependence that the US and China have created, and China with certainly much more with other nations across the world, gives China a huge advantage in the sense that they also know that any steps that might be taken to try to constrain or limit China's freedom of action will come with it some very high costs. So ultimately, one of the strategic challenges we face is to come up with an approach, a new strategic approach to China, not just run by the United States or initiated, but very much in conjunction with our democratic allies, as is the community of democratic nations, because a strategy with China can only succeed if it's coordinated and if it has buy-in and support from a number of other influential countries. And I think part of it has to involve decoupling or limiting or constraining how much dependence we have in terms of our economic engagement with China. At the same time, I think it's important to try to make sure the dialogue with China remains open and that there is a pathway for China to stay connected to the global order and not overtly challenge it or undermine it, at least in terms of security. And so I think there's a nuanced approach that needs to be considered as we try to tackle the China challenge.